You have landed on The Substance. I'm your host, Trevor Aiken.
And I'm your other host, Philip Marinello.
We're two guys thinking critically about faith, culture, and theology.
So before we get into that today, just want to say thanks, everybody who listened. Thank you, everybody who downloaded and subscribed, and especially those who gave a star rating. Thanks for making the launch. Like, man, the response was just a lot.
It exceeded our expectations, definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
And some really fun conversations we've already had. Apparently, a lot of people like to talk back and forth about participation trophies.
Jeez,
the hot button issue.
I remember when we recorded that, I'm like, shoot, this toss-up episode, we're all over the place. I don't know if this is even going to be good, but like everybody that texted me, I feel like far and away, I got like 4 or 5, whether it's like Twitter, Facebook, or text messages I got from folks. Like, I'd say I probably got like 4 times more feedback on the participation trophy thing than like anything else.
Maybe that'll be like a substance thing one day.
Maybe
like
we'll come back
people
to that in the future.
Start getting handed out participation trophies.
That's not going to happen. Maybe they could get it from 50% of the substance here. But also, I mean, I guess that's maybe a good segue. We just want to highlight, we want to build a community here, but we especially want to show gratitude and highlight people who have been just good to us and notably helpful. And the first guy I want to shout out specifically is Matt Walgie here, local listener here in Kansas City.
What up, Matt?
Thanks for all the shares on Facebook and Twitter and already hooking us up with a guest that I have a call with tomorrow. So really, really great listener interaction there.
Love the interaction. Love the thoughts. So keep it up, man. We love what you're doing there. Also, somebody who either checked out on Twitter or through the show notes, our link through the Cash App with our cash tag, The Substance Pod. Matt Szabo, thanks so much for supporting the show in that way. And if you guys want to support the show, there is a link in the show notes for download. You can download the Cash App and then...
Oh, especially if you don't have it. That's when you get that good donation. So you can give us $10 for the cost of $0.
Yeah, this might sound like magic, and it kind of is.
It is. We're this isn't good for the economy, but we want everybody to do it that doesn't already have the Cash App.
It's great. So basically what happens is the people at Square who make the Cash App want people to have their app. And so
they're going after like PayPal and Venmo, and the way to do that is to create free digital money, because why not?
Well, I'm sure it costs them money to do the promotion, but by signing you up, they get you on their platform,
business,
which is what they want. Anyway, if you use that link to download the app, whenever you send your first $5, no matter where you send it, you and us will receive $5 for you using the app. And so if you did happen to send it our way, you would get $5 that would replace that $5 you sent, and we would get $5 also for you downloading the app, which means, like Philip said, you could donate $10 for $0, which is kind of cool.
That was a little complicated.
I don't know. I'm a math guy, so it makes sense to me.
Yeah. If we get you to sign up,
moral of the story is
we get $5. And so if you sign up because of us, we get that money. And basically after you send $5
to explain the thing I just explained,
it was not clear, my dude. That's fine. Okay, forget it. Moving on.
Just rewind, hit that rewind button, and re-listen to it till you understand.
Send us $5 after you use our thing,
or just send an email to thesubstancepod@gmail.com and ask
Trevor
for clearer instructions.
Trevor will help you.
I will definitely read it,
and it may or may not be clear.
Yeah.
Also, shout out to Sam Jacobs out in Florida. Thanks, man.
Honestly, it's such great feedback. Really comprehensive, and just thank you so much for taking the time to write that out and think through that. So,
and everybody, we want to hear. It's not just
dude.
We want to be congratulated. We 100% want you to hit that 5-star button. But if there's anything like pros, cons, we want to hear what you guys have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise, we won't be able to get better. So. Definitely want to be able to do all of those things. But one of the things that we're really excited about on our show is the listener feedback, like we were just talking about. And so one of the things that happens with listener feedback is you can share ideas with us on show topics. And this show is a product of that.
So this is probably, I mean, we have a number of shows in the can already, but this is probably, I imagine, going to be the first show we put out. Basically, that's created at the impetus of the listeners.
Yeah,
impetus maybe isn't the right word.
At the behest.
This is probably the first show that's been created at the behest of the listeners.
I'm just gonna keep it all in.
I knew you would.
So some of our listeners said that for a show topic we should talk about Jordan B. Peterson.
Yeah,
and
I'd say probably maybe like a half dozen or so people
my
suggested
initial reaction to that was, who's that guy?
Really? My initial reaction was, oof, do we really want to do that?
So here we are. In preparation, I've listened to like 14 hours of JBP content.
And I mean, I'm not brand new. Like I've listened to several podcasts and interviews, and I went down the YouTube hole a couple of different times and watched some of his stuff. And I mean, I've skimmed his book too. I'm not a hater, and I'm not a worshiper either. That's something we kind of want to state at the outset. Sure. So the substance, like our tagline is, we want to be thinking critically about things.
Yeah.
So just kind of want to state at the outset that if your position, we'll say, because that's the topic today. So if your position on Jordan B. Peterson is that either he's an evil, hateful, terrible, awful monster, or he's the most important thinking man in the world today, like you're probably more thinking tribally and fearfully or reactionarily than you're thinking critically. So we're going to get into pros and cons and hopefully have some good discussions along the way today.
Whenever we're talking about a person too, we want to be charitable and nuanced and understand, there's a way of thinking about a person and interacting with their ideas. There's a difference between a person and their thoughts.
Especially like a quote unquote like thought leader, somebody who is putting thoughts out there into the culture. Like for the very most part, nobody's just one thing.
Yeah.
Nobody's all good or bad unless you're like the Jesus and Hitler spectrum.
So, I mean, sometimes on this podcast, we're going to ask you maybe to get in the car and ride with us for a little bit, because sometimes we're just going to walk right in the middle, point guns at both sides, pull the trigger and duck. And this might be like that, depending on what our distribution is of folks listening, whether we've got a lot of people who really, really dislike him.
Well, and that's the thing. So whether you like him or dislike him, like that kind of doesn't matter.
I think there's a large number of people who are like, who in the world is this dude?
That's probably true. But I mean, if you're in the podcast space, unless you're just like our extended relatives who are listening to it because of us.
We love you guys, by the way.
Shout out to all of you guys. Thank you. Subscribe, hit that 5-star button. But I mean, if you're in the podcasting space, you're probably at least like tangentially aware of Jordan Peterson.
Absolutely. But if they aren't,
so
give us a summary.
I'll go first. So I was more familiar than Trev was. So I believe I was introduced to him. I don't remember exactly when. I think the first time, because I feel like I had heard people talk about him. Mm-hmm. The first time I was exposed to him and his ideas was on the Jocko podcast, where the first episode that he was on, I believe, he was essentially talking about like the evil that man is capable of. And then maybe a dozen or so episodes later, a couple months later, he was on again talking about his book, which was like, okay. Mm-hmm. At first I was like, okay, like, great. This is a university professor, like he's not denying like the fundamental truths that like deep down, like we're all capable of very bad things, and like people need to be. It was very basic, and it didn't seem terribly out of the ordinary or controversial that the first time I heard him. And then the second time I heard him, he's promoting the 12 Rules for Life.
Yes, 12 Rules for Life is his book.
Yeah, and which I have read chunks of. Sorry, 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. So yeah, he was basically just talking about the ideas in his book, and that's kind of when I started looking at some of his YouTube stuff and some of the ideas that he's been talking about that have been catching flack. And really, like, man, I think that for the people that do really like him, I will give them. I think Jordan B. Peterson is very misrepresented a lot when it comes to other people discussing him, not other people necessarily talking to him.
Hopefully we don't contribute to that in any way.
No, but I mean, like, where he's done long form interviews that have been chopped up to 5 minutes, where they take the most egregious sounding sound bites,
like if he goes on TV
and vilify him.
Yeah,
sure. Which I think that happened with that one with that lady in Canada.
Carl, what? No. Cathy Newman.
Yeah, where
UK, I think
they had UK, somewhere foreign. Our bad.
Shout out to our folks across the pond and north of the border.
We do have Laura and her friends, so there might be some listeners out there.
Apparently you're foreigners.
Yeah.
Which is true, just not in a derogatory way.
Certainly not. So she had him on for a long time. cut up the parts to make him sound bad. And then when they released the full one, it was pretty clear that the initial cut that was put out there was like put out with ill intent.
Yeah.
And that's happened a handful of other times. So we want to do our best to try to really get to like the principles of what he's saying. Because like the personality and like things that are attributed to him, like positively or negatively, kind of don't matter that much.
Right. You have to take somebody in their full nuance, and if you're trying to make a point, like if you're trying to just make a point to silence someone, then yeah, you'll have an agenda. Or if you're trying to just take them, just carte blanche, like either way, if you come to it with your own meaning and trying to impose it, you're not going to learn anything. And that's a loss for you ultimately.
Well, that's true. Yeah. On the other side, it's true. I mean, I have seen believers or people who identify as Christians who think he's like God's gift to the conservative evangelical movement because of certain positions he comes to, like secularly and biologically and evolutionally and philosophically, that are certain endpoints that we come to also. And it's like, oh, like great, we got an intellectual in our corner now.
Yeah.
Which is also not great.
It's almost, you could almost have an entire podcast on the reaction to Jordan B. Peterson, because it's like
very disinterested in that.
I see so much of people talking about like, or trying to think through, is he on our team? And who cares? Like,
what is he saying? And it doesn't have merit.
Exactly. So anyway,
so that's the way we're going to attempt to approach it today here.
Yeah. We want to, let's start out with some of the things maybe that we do think that has merit with him that we're seeing really.
Do you want to kind of give your categories now?
My categories? Well, I mean, categorically, some of the things you have to know about him. So he is a clinical.
Yeah, we apologize again for somebody that doesn't. You want to lay it out?
Yeah. So Jordan B. Peterson, he is a clinical psychologist under the philosophy of a psychologist called Carl Jung. I might be butchering the last name, but it's spelled.
You're not.
Jung.
Jung.
Yeah. So he's done his work in the University of Toronto. He came to light after he had posted some of his lectures on YouTube. Then one night, as he was thinking about Bill C-16 in Toronto, which was going to add transgender as like a protected people group kind of thing, and had some implications around speech and stuff like that, and hate speech.
Anti-discrimination was kind of
anti-discrimination law
cloaked in.
It was 2 a.m. He was awake thinking about it. He posted a reaction video, kind of laying out some of his thoughts there.
It caught fire.
It went viral, and now he's kind of a public figure.
Now he's touring the world.
Right. So that's the power of the internet. Once again, hit that 5-star button.
Go wild with the substance.
but so in the midst of that, he has really tried to keep his message. He says a lot of things. He has social commentary that he talks about. He talks a lot in really broad categories. He sees narratives and how they connect together, and sees themes throughout history and points that out.
Yeah, the history is the big one. Like, I think the broadness, kind of side note, I think the broadness with the history is those two things go together a lot with his material.
Yep. He's very concerned politically, and this is where some people get frustrated with what he talks about as identity politics, and with what he calls the radical left, and some of the ideas that are going around about trying to like reach equality of outcome and a lot of things. So he, with all of that, he's very outspoken against a lot of those ideas, which are very popular ideas. And so he gets a lot of flack for that. At the same time, he also addresses stuff like free speech versus compelled speech. He's talked about gender pay gap. He speaks about what political discourse should look like.
With the gender pay gap, I think he talks a lot about the categories that are promoted, like the oppressor-oppressed dynamic. Like, that's huge.
Yeah.
Like in the political, social kind of outworking of the stuff he's talking about.
And he also points out differences in personalities and uses a lot of those classifications that are like the 5 personality.
And a lot of it does kind of overlap, like the psychology, the political, the social, the historical, and it can get pretty vague. And if you, at the end, like if you love where he ends up, you just think he's the best. And if you hate where he ends up, like he's a monster. And there's not a whole lot of, what thought processes are valid and what are maybe unhelpful generalizations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think it's good to remember that at the end of the day, and sometimes this is helpful when you're thinking about where somebody's coming from is to look at their background and just think about, like, from their shoes, how are they getting to where they're getting? And just to remember, he's a clinical psychologist. So, like, his job is to help people who have problems. Like, a psychologist, somebody who deals with matters of the soul, like in a lot of ways, like a pastor does, but just without a church. And they're dealing with an individual who has goals, who has hurt, who has whatever kind of going on, either mental, not sometimes mentally, but
for
also
sure.
mainly.
That's a lot of the stuff he talks. Like anecdotally, he does talk a lot about how people that we would say have like mental problems are helped.
Yep. And so he's a lot about individual empowerment along that same line, and helping people.
Yeah.
And so some of the reason why
from the clinical psychology perspective.
Exactly. And so then he just starts looking at these broader issues and broader ideas kind of through that lens. And that can actually lead to some of the statements he makes, which can maybe even cross the line a little bit, where he sees certain ideas as being harmful to individuals. And so he gets, maybe a little bit frustrated by them or those kind of things, and makes what I would consider sometimes generalizations. But anyway, that's kind of a broad overview. But let's talk a little bit about some of those good things, some of that individual empowerment and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, so like I said,
spoken a lot about that.
When I first was introduced to him on the Jocko podcast, that's based. So the Jocko podcast, in like a nutshell, he's a former Navy SEAL, got very famous because he went on Tim Ferriss and kind of talked about how he went through the program, and like after he did several tours overseas, he started to develop Navy SEAL training programs. And so like he kind of revolutionized like the way Navy SEALs are trained. And then when he retired, he not accidentally, but like through circumstances, basically became like a business coach. Like he took those principles, like the battlefield principles, and applied them to business, became very noteworthy. I've read some of his books. They're really good principles applied. And so when Jordan B. Peterson came on that, like it was like discipline, like responsibility, ownership of self.
Yes.
Those are all what I think, even like you can be pretty liberal. And I imagine that like that has to resonate somewhat.
Right.
Like responsibility, discipline, like self-ownership, like these are things that we're hopefully striving for.
Right. I love some of the things he said too about just individual like responsibility. For him, one of the big things that he talks about is how what we want is rights, but really what we need is responsibility. And when we own responsibility, he even will talk more about responsibility even than happiness, because he feels like when we take on responsibility, we become more fulfilled.
We create happiness, because one of his other lines is life is suffering and life is pain.
Right.
So in order to make, and chaos, like because of all these things, the responsibility you take for like your immediate context will provide you with whatever the secular version is of joy.
Yeah. So
because you're finding purpose for yourself.
That's right. And so he'll talk about like, when you're setting out on a goal, maybe that goal is to have a family or something like that, to
be successful in business or whatever
it is, to set a goal that's not too high. And I heard him talking with Jocko.
Incremental growth.
Yeah. Like it might even be something as silly as clean your room today. He says he uses that.
I think that's one of the rules.
Yeah. And it's just the idea of there might be something basic of disorder in your life that you could bring order to. And by doing that, you have taken a step towards a greater order in your life. Yeah,
because the way humans are wired, I mean, you hear it anecdotally a lot, like if you're in the self-help or whatever you want to call like personal growth thing, like the ripple effect. So you start working out 4 times a week, you start making more money, your relationships get healthier, your life becomes in order because you are taking steps to bring your life in order.
It's almost similar in a concept to the starting principle, where if there's a big task that you don't want to do, like maybe you have an hour's worth of dishes to do, you tell yourself, you know what, I'll do 5 minutes worth of dishes, and you set a timer and you start working on it, and you tell yourself, hey, when 5 minutes is up, I can stop. If you do that, the likelihood is when you get to that 5 minutes, you're gonna be like, I'm doing it anyway, it's cool, I'm getting stuff done, and you'll keep going, you'll get it all done. When you approach the whole task, maybe feels daunting, but when you just start, you can keep going. And so that's that same idea of like, you have this huge goal, but if you just start with something small and attainable, clean your room.
Well, and I think a lot of
keep that momentum
people
going.
in our generation that maybe haven't been challenged much in their life, or
Not a lot of
like
good
young men
guidance.
and young women who maybe haven't found meaning or created meaning in their lives,
Right.
that are kind of cruising through, like maybe with careers or relationships or educational pursuits that they aren't passionate about. They're not taking ownership.
Right.
They hear these things, and like he fills
people.
stadiums of hundreds and thousands of people, not hundreds of thousands, but like stadiums of hundreds, stadiums of thousands, stadiums of 10,000s. Like he fills them up around the world because people want to have meaningful lives.
That's right.
So it's not like he's not providing anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Even though it's basic, I know some people personally, one of their big critiques of him is, oh, it's so basic. And he even brings that up and he goes, well, yeah, but if people aren't doing it and I'm giving them a vision of like, here's what you can do by like starting and such a simple point as making your bed or lifting like a 15-pound weight, like doing something to start, like that's that can add a whole, like that can revolutionize your entire life.
And I think that is something that drives him. Like as I've listened to him talk, like what gets him excited and what gets him emotional is helping people. And I think if you're a psychologist, like you get into that line of work typically because like you want to understand maybe something that's gone on in your life or something that's going on in the lives of those around you, and you want to do something about it. You want to make it better. And so that's not a bad thing. Like that's good.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time with that, I mean, at least as believers, there's a level of caution there, right? Like,
and that's where, we're coming at this with a lens of faith. And for a believer, for a Christian whose authority is the Bible, you can't lift up any self-help, personal motivation, or discipline guru. Like they don't have anything ultimate to offer. They can have really great principles that can help aspects of your life improve, but like they can't offer true meaning.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's totally true. And there's something to be said too about like how good is it ethically, morally overall to pad someone's life so it's easier here, when it's almost like healing the wounds of the people lightly. Like if you put a Band-Aid over cancer or gangrene, if you take something that's a real serious infection and lightly treat it, it's going to get worse. And if you take something that's a manifestation of the soul's need and like, sin issues, and you're treating it with just here and now solutions.
Yeah, you can stand up real straight, but it won't help you ultimately.
You might be real successful in this world, and it might help you achieve a level
which is
of
not an ignoble goal.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. So anyway, there's nuance there. But like I said, a lot of those are connected with some of the things he talks about politically. And so I want to kind of get into some of that side, especially some of the things he talks about. He loves to rail some of his favorite terms about the radical left, and especially about identity politics.
Sure. Let's get into that briefly.
So what is identity politics? You want to give an example, or I can give a...
So the identity politics game, as he sees it, is where it's the oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are more oppressed, you get more points. And the more points you have, the more valuable your words are. So if like the whole intersectionality, if on the intersectionality spectrum, you are most oppressed, like if you're a female minority that is not heterosexual, you have the most points. So your words are more important. Your point of view is more important. And what he's saying is like, I reject that.
Right. So once again, what Philip's I'm talking about is there are different groups and different labels in a sense that could be tagged to you as an individual. You think about the labels in your life that apply to you, whether you're male or female, or what's your ethnicity, or what's your social status, or what's your whatever. You could go down the list and you can come up with, and he argues you can come up with an infinite number of groups, just a matter of how you want to dice things up.
Sure.
And then you could consider each one of these groups as part of a oppressor or victim kind of status, and the people who have the most number of labels applied
the
to
highest
them,
victimhood, that
is victimness, have a larger voice. And so he says that his idea is kind of this broad idea that is rampant in culture,
which I mean, and that resonates to some degree. You see that out in the public
very
sphere.
Negative.
Do you okay, just me and you here, like I at least can see like what he's talking about. Do you not?
I can see broadly what he's talking about.
Okay.
I think I think most of our listeners like the definition we just gave of identity politics, unless they've listened to Jordan B. Peterson stuff or other things that have been going on. Like it's just a hot button topic to throw around, and it's huge in like academia, maybe.
I'm sure different people. I mean, we both are in the we are aware of some of the academic world. I disagree. Because like with social media being so like prolific, Twitter's probably what I'm on the most, and like you see people on Twitter delivering hot takes and sick burns, and like you can say how serious are people being? Are they being tongue in cheek just to try to be funny? But like people can be dismissed because they're the so-called majority culture, or not even so-called majority culture in some instances. But like if you are the historic majority, or if anybody in your circles have oppressed other people, like your voice is counted as less in some groups. That's not untrue.
True. And I'm not saying that we are not living in a culture that is not very politically charged in a way where it's really quick to demonize somebody or jump on somebody's case. I saw a post of a famous soccer player who was posing for a nativity scene and people were jumping down his throat about some race stuff, and race wasn't even really part of his consideration with it.
No, people have things they like, people have things they don't like, a lot of times for reasons that aren't thought through very well.
Sure.
And if you appear to have any affiliation with the thing that they don't like, you're thrown out and you don't even get to speak for yourself.
And I think the issue is not, but see, and this is my thing, I don't think the issue is identity politics. I think the issue is charity. You could have a well thought through, even whatever postmodernist identity politics scheme and treat people charitably. The problems that you're talking about is a different issue. That's talking about when somebody's jumping down the throat of this soccer player who's just trying to celebrate the nativity with his friends. They're coming at it from viewing like, hey, there is systemic oppression and racism, and when people in high visibility do stuff like this and have these kind of whatever it was where they didn't consciously try to do something racist, but maybe it could be perceived that way. People feel like they have a responsibility to think through all of these implicit biases and avoid those so as to train the culture or whatever that in some ways, because we grow up in a certain way or from a certain region or a certain culture, and they feel like it's their job to point out the cultural blindnesses we have, but we all have those.
I think that's part of it, but I mean, again, I've seen it charitably. I've seen it on quote unquote news programs. I've definitely seen it on Twitter and Facebook where like people will throw things around like, oh, well, you're just a white male. What do you know? Like you can be like the whole identity politics of you're not even worth listening to because of categories you fall in.
Yeah.
That's not uncommon in the public sphere.
Well, let me say this, that I haven't read any political treatise from somebody who would hold to what would be considered an identity politics theory. And so I can't say that malpractice and lack of charity towards an individual is part and parcel with their political theory.
No, I'm saying in the public sphere, and it's trickled down. And one of the things Peterson talks about a lot is But
I think that precision is important. If we're going to decry identity politics as a negative ideology, then just pointing out to general bad actions that people have when they're not charitable is not the same as critiquing an idea.
Well, I think I will give him that. I think he does critique that starting at the university level, and that it trickles down. Like if academia is like doing the whole like word policing thing and the identity politics, like at the levels of university and like publishing and things like that does trickle down into like Joe Schmo on Twitter, Facebook, who's just thinks that you're not worth listening to because of this or that. Like, I think that definitely can be valid.
I think it can be. I think you can't necessarily say, well, hey, because this person wrote this academic paper espousing this, and this other dude took it and thought about and talked about and started this group, which liked all these ideas and started pressing this social action in this way that had this effect. Like, it's way too far of a knockdown from like the original source thing that we're trying to that we're talking about. So let's deal with that issue. Let's deal with Joe Schmo like not being charitable towards an individual or not thinking before criticizing, which it's really easy to do on Twitter or social media or things like that. Like, we see that problem everywhere. We see that problem on both sides of the political sphere. It doesn't have any necessary connection to one ideology when we're seeing both sides do it.
I don't even think it has to do with necessarily an ideology, but one of the things that I think he is trying to shine light on is that in a more liberal culture, like that can easily happen without you thinking about it, and you should realize that and
that's good. We should
get to the roots of that.
We should always think about ways that we are maybe without even thinking about it, not treating people kindly.
Sure.
And try to be more kind, and try to be more Christ-like and being considerate. And so I think that's better, because here's the thing about his identity politics is he gets
can be pretty vague, though.
He gets so individual that he almost says that it's not valid. I think he even made this statement in the monk debate where he said groups don't have rights, individuals have rights. Or like groups, because a right is tied. He made this argument that like somehow a right is tied to a responsibility, but it doesn't make any sense to talk about a group having a responsibility, because what does that even mean? And anyway, it got really complicated. And at the end of the day, it's like, yeah, actually groups do have rights. Like if I'm going to define, you have the right to remain silent, who has that right? Well, that's a right given to American citizens by the Supreme Court of America. So that is a group identity that you consider their rights. So it is legitimate to think of people in terms of the groups that they belong to, and then to look at what rights or challenges that group faces and think about how to address those problems systematically, because that is how in a society you assign rights and privileges to people, is you assign it to a group, and then all the members of that group carry that right or privilege. Same way that I have, the right to obtain whatever paycheck from the company I work for, is I am an employee for that company. I'm part of that group. And if I'm not part of that group, I'm not part of that conversation. So there's everything,
You're kind of throwing a lot here. So are we kind of transitioning to the individual group kind of deal now?
Well, I think that goes directly with the identity politics that he does not like, because what he feels like is that if we allow identity politics, then he even says free speech collapses if you believe in identity politics, because you can't speak as an individual anymore. You are only
your words are viewed through your position in the part of the group, which is why I feel like you're the straight white male, like in academia, like he's saying that you're just getting less, I guess, credibility, because you are like you have the worst history of oppression in that hierarchy or whatever.
Yeah.
And therefore blah 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 blah.
Well, and I think we have to look at when there are times when that criticism is valid to be brought, and there's times when that criticism isn't valid to be brought. I honestly do think that there are times that some of the reason why, and I think if you listen to enough of some of the things that he says, that Jordan Peterson says, is like the fact that he is a Canadian guy, a white Canadian guy, does mean that there are challenges unique to the American experience, unique to our history and our culture and the laws of our land and the rights movements that we've gone through, that he just wasn't part of. And that's not to say anything negative about him. That's just to make an observation that because he's not part of that, he's going to view that from a different lens.
Interesting. I didn't even think about that.
I'm not taking part of identity politics to point that out, but I am putting him in a group and saying, because he's in that group,
he has a limited perspective.
It's possible that his perspective is different, or that he hasn't experienced what somebody in this group experienced, because it's okay to categorize. He does it. So as soon as you categorize, you engage in group, like putting people into group and making decisions about things based on that group, which if you're going to use identity politics as a very, very broad term instead of just a specific thing, and decry anybody who does that, you do that. So that's my criticism of that idea, is that there is legitimate ways to talk about that.
To people in groups?
To think about people in groups, and even to think, because he also talks about he doesn't like oppressed dynamics and that kind of thing. And sure, I think his whole thing with that is don't be a victim.
Yeah. Which again
Fair,
goes
but don't
to
victimize.
the personal psychological individual.
Yeah.
Like if somebody walked into his office and it's like, oh, my life sucks because my girlfriend or my boss or my parents, and he's like, cut that crap out. Don't be a victim. That's different than looking at a society that may or may not have victimized people in different ways at different times.
Yeah.
Like those are conflating like the individual with like a group.
And I think it's like there's the one side where it's like, okay, yeah, Jose comes to you and he wants to get into XYZ company and that's his target. And so you counsel him like, hey, don't be a victim, like do the things you need to do. That's legitimate to help him out, to help him get into XYZ company, to show him the ways to think and empower and take responsibility on his own side.
All right.
You can't change the whole system as an individual, so do what you can. On the other hand, it's legitimate to say he shouldn't have to write Joe on his resume to get hired at XYZ company.
Sure.
And that's, I'm using that example because that's something that has literally happened, where a dude submitted his resume to a company with his actual name on it, and it was rejected. And then he got the interview and the job when he changed his name on the resume to Joe from Jose.
I hadn't heard about that. That's interesting.
So like stuff like that, when stuff like that's happening, the hierarchy that he talks about hierarchies a lot. It's just a broad way to say system.
Let's bring that. Let's get to the hierarchy.
Later.
I feel like we're kind of muddying it a little bit. And I'm even not sure where you're going with this.
And I mean, he does
Jose
too.
Joe thing, and that is, I think, a very valid criticism. But let's run to the end of this Jose Joe thing, which I think is, where did you hear about this?
Oh gosh, it's been a long time.
That's fine. That doesn't matter.
Sure.
So, but I mean, that's a very interesting thing. So how do you think he would view that?
Well,
and this is a little bit of speculation.
I have no idea. There's sometimes
I
I'd
thought
love
you brought that up because you were saying he would say XYZ thing.
Well, I think that's the problem, is he speaks broadly about these things like, well, it's not right to view Jose as a member of the Hispanic community that it's oppressed. Well, he should instead just take individual responsibility, not worry about oppressor oppressed. Maybe he would say that. It sounds like that's what he would say in this specific example.
In a manner, and like there could be a way where that could come off in specific situations as actual good advice.
And
but to give it broadly without any care to the specific context of, if that happened, I'm taking that as a thing that happened.
Yeah.
If that happened, that would be incorrect.
Right.
To like say this has nothing to do with your quote unquote like identity, and like you're not.
Yeah.
Don't be anyone's victim. Like you can't help it.
Right.
If the hierarchies like are against you.
And I think that was actually a really good point that somebody in the Monk debate brought up, was like, yeah, you don't like identity politics. I don't like it either, but it was forced on. I wasn't the one
that's
who.
interesting.
I wasn't like he was.
I feel
a
like
black
that's
guy
almost
saying,
a different show.
Almost, but it comes up because if you're just gonna say, well, hey, this isn't a legitimate thing.
I thought that guy, honestly, and I mean, you can maybe give some context to what you're referencing with the Monk debate, but I thought that guy had a lot of whack things to say.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
but
absolutely.
I thought that was a very good, I thought that was one of his
solid
strongest points, where it's like
they weren't talking about the topic at hand at all.
The people that JBP might talk down to as claiming victimhood, like a lot of people in that culture, whether you're going like ethnic or gender with that, they're probably like, they didn't choose that for themselves.
Right.
They didn't choose to be like black or Hispanic or female in these environments that are not conducive necessarily to the success of those sorts of folks.
Right. So I'm not saying that like individual empowerment's not an amazing, great concept.
Which goes to him like railing against the equality of outcome, and it all gets muddled.
Yeah.
They aren't like clear lines of thought. They do kind of overlap. And
they
get
do
muddled.
Because some of the things and the reasons why he champions the kind of individual identity kind of thing is because when he looks at society, he looks at what he calls the hierarchy, which is just the ordering of society and awarding people
successful.
Yeah,
like successful and unsuccessful.
Yeah. He says it mainly rewards competence.
Okay.
So mainly if you're good at what you do, you'll get ahead.
You will naturally rise.
You'll get ahead.
If you and 5 other people do a task and you're the best one at that task, you will rise to the top of the hierarchy, like in that category.
And that may be broadly true, but I think it just ignores the fact, and I think he says like on the whole, society is generally fair. Society is generally like you can get ahead. And yeah, like statements like that I struggle with, because how can you say that when even like the Christian moral universities like just got through like stopping their bans on interracial marriage within the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So how are we so far beyond that? How are we so far into a fair society where it's like you literally couldn't be like a white guy with a black wife on campus at Christian universities in the last 20 years? And so it just ignores, and this is where I think people get very, very frustrated with him, because it just ignores the actual factual history of our country, where people were oppressed and where people were disadvantaged, and to imagine that somehow we have just eradicated all of that, imbalance.
Well, one of the things he does talk about is that, like, the refining nature of society, like a society that's trying to be productive will, like, eventually realize these things. And he's like, oh, like, well, the civil rights was part of this and this and that, where it's like we are naturally necessarily taking steps to correct these things over time.
But I disagree that it just naturally happens.
Agreed.
That seems a little bit reductionistic to me, to just say, oh, well, we progress because we progress. Well, actually, at the same time,
kind of didn't.
There's a lot of societies that went the other direction that you talk about and you are concerned about. And so he talks about that. And, it's kind of interesting. Let's get into this radical right versus radical left thing and the definition there. Can we talk about that, or you want to?
No, I think that's good.
So he talks about the radical left a lot.
And by no, I mean yes. Apparently, I can't talk straight.
No, your nose mean yes.
They do quite a bit.
So one of the things that he says is that the radical right has a very the right side of the political spectrum, conservative side of the political spectrum, has the radical very well defined. Like everybody on both the conservative and the liberal side recognize when the conservatives have gone too far. And he says what that looks like typically is
today's like the all right.
Yeah, like racism / nationalism.
Yes.
Just, very defined boundaries, racially defined boundaries, like put everybody in their group. Once again, this is what he's talking about, hierarchy. He likes to think of hierarchy almost in the sense of borders. Like we're very, very, he's used this term, talking with, I think it was either Joe Rogan or Jocko. He talked about this concept of borders and ultimately.
Once you cross the line.
Yeah. And like just having very, very well defined groups, and like liberal kind of wants very, very easy to pass through, kind of loose categories. So like
continue with
so anyway, like that's what he considers as the radical right, is when that becomes so rigid that it's like we become ethnically rigid.
Yes.
And decry one against the other. But his point is that what isn't as well studied is the radical left. He says on the liberal side, we see when the liberal side went too far in history with
the equality of outcome,
with communism and with Stalin and with, to some extent China.
Sure.
And those kind of things as well. And when that went really wrong, but we don't have a really good understanding from the people on the left to say, hey, this is when our ideologies are going too far, or we've got too far. And do
you think he has a point on that or no?
I think what he wants to argue is he thinks the main thing is the idea of equality of outcome. He actually lists 3 ideas. This idea, diversity and equity, and there was one other one that he talks about, but he really hits the equity one hard, which is this equality of outcome, that when you look at, for example, CEOs, you should in theory have a equal distribution
of the population.
So if you have 50% white and 30% black and 20% Hispanic, then you should see roughly 50% white CEOs, 30, etc.
Sure.
And you could, and his point is, if you do this across every group, you could always find a group that they would be out of balance with. And I think he makes maybe some good points there. At the same time, I don't think that's the definition of the radical left. My idea, so if I could interact with some of his ideas here, like, I don't think that this is actually that big of a problem. I don't think it's really hard to see where governments, whether radically right or radically left, go wrong. On both sides, you could summarize both the communist side and the Nazi side, right? If you want to talk about the radical left and the radical right, in one thing, and that is governments go wrong when they start exercising their authority to prosecute and to persecute, which a government rightly has. The government has the right to persecute people. It's called jail. And we can talk about how sometimes we do that bad too, even when trying to do that right. But when the government starts exercising that based on identity instead of actions.
Yep.
That's my summary of whenever any side, radically right or radically left, goes wrong. When who you are instead of what you do, what you've done defines the fact that you should be persecuted by the government. Like, yes. That's when you've gone too far.
But I mean, to play devil's advocate here, and to where I think I understand what he's saying, and I think that there is some validity to it, where in a culture where the media has the influence that it does, and by and large the media is left-leaning,
sure,
where the media portrays the extreme right so much that kind of the undercurrent that he's saying, and I mean, I've seen it to some degree, not that there's no respected conservative people anymore, but that like the media gives so much attention to the extreme right that the reasonable middle right, like people go, reasonable middle right, does that even exist? And then
it almost starts to feel like there is no reasonable middle anything.
Good night. Well, yeah, and that's the problem with like the CNN versus Fox News and like Republican versus Democrat, like the bipartisan nation that has kind of been solidified. Like, and it's always been there to some degree, but like really in the last few years, it really has seemed to like just boil up.
Yeah, and to JBP's credit, like he's said multiple times that like we need both sides to be in tension and discourse because we're going to face problems as society that we don't have writing to fix, and so we need to talk it out.
Well, and that's why again, like extreme positions aren't helpful,
right?
Like if and that's we can maybe even link to that in the show notes. I shared it with a handful of people that Fresh Air about Newt Gingrich.
Yes,
the polarization and the near like militarization of political parties against one another. The detrimental effect that that's had, where people almost forget that like the blue and the red folks out there, we are brethren in the American sense. Like if we live in this country or living in communities together, whether like you are liberal or conservative, like you do actually have commonality if you want like our society to like have stability and progress. We must work together,
right? Or
just have a civil war and destroy ourselves.
Well, and people forget because politics becomes almost such a swear word, like where it's like, oh man, I just don't even like politics, or like makes people's blood level rise even to start to talk about politics. But we just forget that like what politics is a science / philosophy of us trying to figure out what's the best way for people to like
act in community,
community, to govern one another, like to govern themselves in our case, because we don't have some authority monarchy over us, like we are self-governing. So that's what we're trying to do. Like, and we're all in this together in a sense, like to figure out what's the best way to do this.
And it's fine if you think differently than your neighbor, but it's not fine to go because my neighbor thinks differently, either like they're like a liberal monster or they're a conservative idiot. Like you can't think about people in those categories and caricatures and have any hope of like progress.
If you have competing scientific theories, like in literature, whether it's in the field of economics or behavioral sciences or any science, it's not the case that one side's moral and the other side's not. They're trying to work together.
Say that again.
If you have any science and you have competing theories in that science, it shouldn't necessarily be thought to be the case that one of those theories is moral and one of those theories is immoral.
You prove your cases and you're either correct or incorrect.
You're just, you're doing the process, testing your hypotheses.
Not to say that things can't get immoral. Not to say that the extremes
Certainly they
aren't
can.
immoral. History shows that the extremes of both conservative and liberal thought and policies can get very immoral.
Right. And sometimes the science can be a lackey to that. I'm not saying that science is somehow this great regulating amoral
which is
authority.
interesting. You brought up Stalin and Hitler. Like, I'd be interested to see, like, if there was like a bot out there that could just like scour the internet, the lobbing of communist or Nazi at somebody like the last 5 years has just gone up astonishingly.
Well, and I think that's part of the issue too, is that, like, Jordan Peterson, he's written the foreword to this new edition of this book, Gulag Archipelago, which is all about
like changing. He read that when he was a kid. Like that is that's like a sacred text for him.
And I thought it was really interesting. One of the podcast hosts that he was talking with said, "Yeah, I read that book, and it didn't do for me what it did for you." and I think that's interesting, because I think that's so often the case with books, where you already have thinking in your head, and when you read a book, you start putting the facts from that book on the shelf in ways that maybe the author intended, maybe he didn't, but I know he has a good relationship with the author of that book.
Well, you read it through your experience.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think when he sees that, he starts seeing this like path that society can go down, and he's afraid that society with identity politics is going down a path that leads to, well,
Stalinist Russia.
Yeah, these people are, the oppressors or the greedy people who are stealing from you. They're the thieves. So let's put them in the gulag. Yeah, let's take away their land. Let's put them in the gulag. Well, okay. Well, now you're the friends. Where does that end? And it just balloons until you can just use that to. But that's what I'm saying. Like, there's a difference between recognizing groups and recognizing like people, even if they're oppressed groups or not, and a government persecuting on the basis of identity, right? These are different things. And so he's saying, by thinking about this and talking about this, and even in the Twitter sphere, this kind of thing, doing that, and by the government even coming up with hate speech, even maybe hate speech that we don't think is hate speech, right? That
like the compelled speech or free speech,
right
part.
And let's even take it to the extreme of saying, like, maybe a pastor goes to jail for preaching a sermon on Romans 1. Okay. Like
the criminalization of what is deemed hate speech.
That's still, even though I would disagree with that, that's still not the same as Stalinism of saying, well, a pastor, so now you go to jail.
But I mean, his argument, and I think that, are you saying there's not validity in going, these are steps 1, 2, and 3, and we don't want to get to step 10?
I'm saying that, I think there's not validity to that because of the law of the undistributed middle. So like this error, this fallacy of, saying X is Y and Y is Z, but then in between those two statements, you changed what Y was. So you haven't proven anything. You haven't proven that X is Z in that case, because you have to prove that these two things are the same in the middle. So you can say step 1 leads to step 2, and step 9 leads to step 10. But if you haven't proven that step 2 leads to step 9, like necessarily, you can't say that we're on the way to step 10.
Interesting.
That's not good argument.
Know if
that's not good logic. That might be good broad categorization, and it might tell a good story. But it's not good logic. It's not good thinking. That's my point. And so I think we just need to talk clearly. If he thinks it's immoral for the government, and I think it would be bad and immoral for the government to
compel speech,
to put that pastor in jail for preaching a Romans 1 sermon, because he's doing a moral good, and the government shouldn't persecute someone who is doing a moral good action. But that's not the same as rounding up people summarily because you can say that they're XYZ category and put them in the gulag. Like, that's different.
I don't know. I feel like I'm 50-50 on that one. I don't know if I'm entirely.
I just think to say, oh, well, it all leads there. Like, it's all a slippery slope.
Not that it all definitely leads there, but the idea
you can say anything is a slippery slope to anything. And
sure.
I mean, we do that in entertainment stuff. Like, if you think about this, and for the entertainment things, like, people will say, oh, well, if you watch that movie, that's a slippery slope to X. And you're like, that argument's stupid. That's the same kind of argumentation he's using to say that, oh, well, this is a slippery slope to communism. Not necessarily. Like not unless you prove it. Show me how. That's my thing.
Well, I think the argument to some degree would be like, I could show you after it goes there and society is like detrimentally affected.
Right. That's too late.
To a degree where it's like, we're going to need a lot of time and effort to build back. Going like the step one of criminalizing speech isn't good.
We've always criminalized speech. We've always criminalized speech.
Give me an example.
You can't defame someone. There is certain speech that's been criminal always. That's the other thing I don't get. He talks about we started criminalizing speech. There's speech is less criminalized now than it ever has been. You can say more things now in more public spaces and not end up in the clink than ever before in history.
Well, okay, maybe not criminalized. And one of the things that there was talked
but I
about
think that's
in that
important
debate,
though, because you say criminalized speech and he has too, and he's talked about how we're starting to criminalize all this speech and it didn't used to be that way. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, have you looked at the laws from like colonial America? Of course, there was criminalized speech.
Sure, not that you can't ever say anything that is.
You just don't want to criminalize the speech that I think is part of good discourse.
Yes,
that's what he wants to say.
Yes,
but,
maybe.
But we need to have that conversation on what is good discourse and what is hateful. I mean, I think there is validity to people wanting to find that line. And so I think we just have to be careful of blanket statements. We need to be nuanced.
I definitely agree that we need to be careful. But I mean, as believers in a culture that's not overtly friendly to our message, like, I think that's why a lot of believers probably really like him, because of that whole, like, I'm blanking on which state now, but like where there were a number of like the bakeries. There's one particular bakery that got shut down and all that. Like that whole deal where it's like, that's they faced legal repercussions. For they were told they were being hateful.
Yeah. And what's interesting that you brought that up.
Yeah.
Because when Jordan Peterson was talking to Joe Rogan about that specific incident, he initially said, I don't think that they should have been compelled to do that. But then he hedged on it. He was like, I don't know.
Yeah. Because he was hit with, well, what if they don't want to
make a case for black people?
Exactly.
So the point, and here's the point is what are legitimate categories? And as a society, like, we live in a society that is democratic. So we don't have, we are self-governing. And so if we decide as a society that this is what constitutes what we consider a human individual, in a sense, we have the authority to govern ourselves in that way. And so I'm not saying that's right. Of course it's right. Like, this is why Christians in the 1700s were anti-democracy, because they didn't think that people should be the final authority. They thought God should. So, and obviously a theocracy is problematic too, but like in the sense of a human mediated one that's not perfect. Obviously the ultimate government will be a theocracy if you believe the Bible. But let me finish that.
I was just going to say, let's
reign and ruled by Jesus Christ. But the point being that, like, it's hard, right? It's hard when we live in a society where people are allowed to govern themselves. If a lot of those people get ideas that are contrary to truth, they have the right, theoretically, painting in broad strokes again, to make that into law and to oppress people who have a separate morality.
That's true.
So, I mean, and he's pushing back on that by saying these things aren't true. This is not reality. And we agree with him. Now, we don't agree with him for the same reasons he thinks that's the case, because we're standing on the Bible and he's standing on Jungian philosophy or, his worldview of that. Like, and so there's obviously some tension there, but yeah, I think in as much as he's a voice for, like, hey, like, men are men and women are women, and some of the things that he's saying about the differences there, which are just biologically true.
Yeah, which is why again, like we talked about, I feel like that's a big reason why people in the conservative or Christian camps really do like him, because of some of the conclusions he is vocal about.
I just think we have to, and I think we have to be careful as like citing him as like, well, this is the reason why, these people in the Christian sphere who are speaking out on social justice or Marxist or whatever else, or they don't know what they're talking about. Like,
he's not necessary for clear biblical and biological
Right.
truths.
I want to just be careful about the generalizations. Be careful about the categorizations. Like, categories are nice, broad categories are nice, meta narratives are nice. He really gets into meta narratives and motifs and all those kind of things. And basically anything he says after, well, the Bible has a very interesting story. Basically anything he says after that, you can almost discount.
Yeah, no,
90% of the time.
hermeneutics are not great.
Pretty rough.
he had some real zingers.
some
Last
good ones.
week or two, I was just looking at some stuff to prepare for this man. He's got a interesting view on the Bible.
Yeah. So it's just recognize, I guess, like when he's saying stuff, he's talking very generally. He's talking from a clinical psychological perspective. He wants to help people. He wants to help individuals. And so he's good at the individual level, but he's not trained in politics. He's not trained in law. He's not trained in these broader categories that he's speaking into. And I think it's important to just recognize that. That's not to say he can't speak into those. Of course he can. He's an educated guy.
Yeah,
he's
he
read.
doesn't have points.
But just take everything with a grain of salt. He's not dealing with the specifics of that academia. He's bringing the specifics of the academia he knows and trying to find these big narratives and these big pictures and talk in those ways. And then sometimes in those broad categories, that's fine, but the devil's in the details.
I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. I don't know. It is hard because of the dramatic and yet subtle shift between the specific and the broad, that it can get kind of hard and kind of murky to delineate between some of those things.
Right. And I think as a person, he has pointed out, like, it is very insightful to see some of the things you talked about at the top of the show, which was like when news media organizations want to paint him in one way or pillory him in one way,
Sure.
or say that he's something that he's not.
To label him something negative and bad and then just discount him entirely.
And I think that's a bad reflection. It's a bad look for society when it's like the people who are supposed to have integrity to tell the people what's going on so that we can make informed decisions on the kind of world that we live in and what actions we need to take are manipulating reality in that way.
Yeah, like that Vice interview, and like Vice is supposed to be like the edgy, we're just going to give you the unfiltered truth, and like that was rugged. That was not great. And that's what, honestly, a lot of the people in my circle who are my more liberal friends, like the coverage he got on that Vice article is why a lot of people discount him and don't even look at anything he has to say because they've heard these like wild misquotes of things he said, and it's like, oh, like that guy is like a nutbag.
I think this segues actually into something he says about media, and we're probably going long, but apologies. You know, you can
cut down,
hit the pause button, or come back to us later. But
it's a podcast.
Yeah. So he talks about media, and he talks about this kind of misrepresentation in the media, and he talks about how it's losing integrity, and then he talks about print and media, like these big media organizations versus podcasts and YouTubes and that kind of stuff. And saying that it's a positive thing. It's
that long form can deal with nuance.
Right.
It boils in, I mean, I just finished that episode earlier today. In my mind, what it boiled down to was like whether you're doing a 30-minute show or an hour show, you have your commercial breaks, you have your time slots, you have your beats. That format is not geared towards nuance at all.
Right. And I think what they're pointing out, and they think that, you know, when this new media is finally comes all the way into its own, you can make the argument that maybe it already has, you know, and then these old media formats, the newspapers, the journals, these kind of things are going to die off, and the magazines, whatever else, they'll go out of business. Nobody's going to read their stuff. They lose their credibility, and we'll have this new, you know, objective. You can hear you can interact, you can engage with ideas.
You can hear tone, you can hear a full actual explanation of an idea rather than just like a 2-minute segment on a late night show.
Right. I wish I was as optimistic about that and about that kind of movement. I don't know that we're necessarily going to. I don't necessarily agree that long form unedited is the wave of the future or the best format for things. I'm very pro editing. As the guy who edits this podcast, I'm very pro that kind of thing. And not only that, some people have pointed out, and I think this is very true, that nowadays, because of social media, because of YouTube, because of podcasts, you can actually curate for yourself, unlike news in the 50s, for example.
Where you had like 2 or 3 channels.
You had 2 or 3 channels that kind of like aligned on stuff that felt like objectivity in news, but it was only because there was uniformity really in perspective. But nowadays, you can curate, and if I'm a whatever, like you could pick a category: flat Earth, alt-right, climate change denying, climate change proponent, feminist, anti-feminist, like whatever. Pick a category. You can find a very healthy amount of media coverage
completely geared towards you.
Yeah, in your wheelhouse.
Okay.
And you can curate for yourself, and people do.
Which is what people do, yeah.
And not only that, social media, if you use social media a lot, it will tend to, if it has a curating algorithm,
it
will
does
curate
for
this for you. Things that you like and that aligns with your thinking. And I bring this up because you brought up the Vice article. When I look at Vice, to me, it's very obvious that they have a certain slant. Now, that's helpful sometimes to me. Sometimes I need that slant.
Sure.
Sometimes I want to read stuff from that angle. That's not my normal angle. Vice is not my normal cup of tea, honestly. But sometimes you need that. Now, if that's all you read, though, you can curate for yourself a wall of media that is only your kind of walled garden that you can't see over into other perspectives, and that's actually a very, very horrific reality.
Agreed.
That's not progression. And, and that's not a Gutenberg revolution if everybody just can't end up talking past each other.
Sure. But I think, again, that was a very, what he was talking about there. Because, again, I just listened to that. I think, again, you sometimes take things, and I feel like you maybe take them another step or two beyond what I was saying. I think just the bare fact of, with whether it's YouTube or podcasts, you can, whatever it is you're trying to say, you can kind of work it all the way out.
Sure.
And like speak for yourself and not be like mischaracterized, or like you can't speak for yourself fully that in a way you couldn't, unlike if you're doing like a 10-minute interview.
Sure. And that's great if, as long as it's getting out there, people are listening to it and it's affecting more than just the base of people who already agree with you. And that's my point. So like, I think
like it's easier to get that form of media is easier to deal with, meaning because there's less constraints on it. Not whether or not people are going to curate like an echo chamber for themselves, but the fact that this media is more geared, like it is more likely to be able to deal with things in a more meaningful way. I think that's all that he was saying.
I think he was saying more than that, honestly. He was making a lot of statements about...
I didn't necessarily read that into
Gutenberg revolution, and it was just going to completely displace the current media strategies, and he really trusts that people are going to be able to, move forward, and it's going to be all this better thing for society. I mean, he said pretty much all of that. And I think it's interesting because you have other people who are analyzing the direction of media and don't have necessarily that optimistic of an outlook. And not to be pessimistic, I hope that it, people tend towards,
podcasts
the positive
like
as well.
The Substance.
Yeah, but I don't know, it's just something to think of.
Sure.
And I think just for our listeners too, like what an important thing to make sure to do to not just curate for you a bunch of people that only think like you.
And that's, again, like that's something that kind of, not being silly here, like self-promoting, like that's something we're really like trying to be very thoughtful and intentional about. We obviously think the things we think, and we're not going to apologize for that.
Right.
But the goal is to do our best to be like, if we're going to be strong on a subject or on a position, to have a reason for it, and to, wherever it makes sense, to interact with others on that.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a good time to kind of do a little bit of teasing. But by this point in the schedule, we might have already had a guest or two on episodes. But I mean, I've got some really good guests in the pipeline for us. And I mean, I'm excited to get guests on us who don't agree with us and to interact with them on these issues.
I think that would be really fun. Just to get, because when we get those conversations going, a lot of times what we're going to see is that things are not as flattened out as maybe we thought they were.
Yeah.
And that will actually help our solutions and help the conversations and help us.
Echo chambers are never, ever helpful for progress, like personally or like culturally or intellectually. Like you can't grow if you're never challenged.
Yeah. And I think there's a sense in which like listening is kindness, and it's treating someone as a human, and it's caring for them. And you think about like Jesus and how he interacted with the world and affected it. Like he came into places that in society, like, people would not go into, and he would do that to bring truth. So he was who he was, and he stood on what he stood on. He wasn't going to change on that, but he wasn't also going to let whatever cultural barriers that were meaningless stop him from accomplishing his mission, which was to share the gospel of repentance. That's our role model.
Agreed. All right, Trev. So, any final thoughts? Are we kind of? Because I mean, it is scattershot. It's kind of hard to do these.
It's hard to
things,
nail. It's hard to nail one guy down who is so prolific. Check it out for yourself. Listen to some of his stuff. Always.
It's not short.
Everything. Think critically. We're gonna link to some of the stuff we mentioned on the podcast today in the show notes. So feel free to take a look at those things. And there's beneficial things there. And something that our pastor says a lot is you got to learn to pick the flowers, leave the weeds. And
that's true.
It is a very true thing.
All right. So
thank you so much for this topic. This is a really fun conversation.
Yeah. Thanks to the folks. Man, it was weird. Like,
it really made me think.
A number of people, I feel like in the same day, were like, "Oh, Jordan Peterson, like, you should talk about that."
Yeah. So I hope this hit what you were hoping for.
And I hope, man, I hope we were able to be somewhat clear.
Hopefully we got to some of the substance as well of it, like to get to what is at the heart of how to think about something and bring out some broad principles that are helpful to think through. I certainly enjoyed it. It made me think a lot, for sure, to kind of balance out some of, so much balance is necessary.
Yeah, agreed. So
keep it up.
Keep those suggestions coming, whether that's on Twitter or Facebook or emailing, or if you're in our community immediately, shoot us a text message. But I mean, you can reach out to us on Facebook, Twitter, or email, or you can call the Substance Hotline.
That's right. You can call us at 913-703-3888. Jump on that.
Have we checked the voicemail line recently?
Yeah. I mean, as of a few days after launch, nobody has called us yet.
Oh, word. We did just launch the other day. Maybe we can take that out.
It's existed for us a lot longer than it's existed for you guys.
That's very good. Okay. Scratch. I've been saying it into a microphone many episodes. We have recorded several episodes
for months. Yeah.
That I've said this into the microphone.
Yeah.
But people have been able to do it for 2 days.
These things are true. But do jump on the Facebook. That is Facebook.com/thesubstancepod, Twitter.com/thesubstancepod,
or at the Substance Pod if you're using an app like a normal person.
That too. We even have a subreddit now.
Oh yeah,
are the Substance Pod. So
the Substance Pod on the platforms.
We'll be posting up some discussion threads on there. So if you use that platform, check us out there,
and you can email us at thesubstancepod@gmail.com.
Yeah, keep up on those platforms, giving us your suggestions, your feedback, future show topics. Connect us with your favorite famous hosts that you want us to talk to.
You guys got any people notable in the religious community, the arts community, people in the community doing important or interesting substantive things? We'd love to chat with them. And if anybody knows Kevin DeYoung, I think that might be a theme for now until we get Kevin DeYoung on the podcast. I don't know.
That'd be fun. All right. Well, thanks for stopping by today.
Thanks again for listening, everybody.
And we'll see you next time.
Subreddits.
Dee-ba-dee-dot-doot-de-doot.
Blub, 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 blub.
Having like a does not compute moment right now.